In the 4th century Rome had about 1,700 mansions, domus, and 46,000 apartment blocks, insula. The mansions housed the noble and wealthy citizens, while the majority of the population lived in apartment blocks. At the end of the 3rd century BC, concrete began to be used in the construction of houses, which made the buildings more durable. In Rome, insulae built in the 2nd century have survived to this day. The standard insulae had 3 or 4 floors and more rarely 5 or 6. The first floor was usually occupied by the wealthier people, while the upper floors were occupied by the poor. The higher the apartments, the smaller the floor area and the smaller the windows. Some insulators had running water and sewage, but only on the ground floor. In the absence of latrines, residents had to use public toilets and take their garbage to the nearest garbage dump or simply throw it out the window. Juvenal mentions the dangers of a passerby passing by an insula. It would be good if they only spewed sewage, or if they threw a broken pot on his head. Buildings in Rome burned quite frequently. The reason for this was that to make buildings cheaper, the builders tried tricks using cheaper materials. For example, they used cheap sulfur instead of red pozzolana. They also used wood instead of stone and brick substructures. The close proximity of the houses contributed to the rapid spread of fire. A fire department was not established until Augustus, but its efficiency with the technical capabilities of the time was low. Rome was almost completely burned out several times. In addition to fires, the collapse of buildings was not uncommon. As a rule, there was no glass in the insulae. Glass was extremely expensive and was used mainly in bathing rooms. Mica, which let little light through, was at best in apartments. The shutters were simply closed in bad weather or cold. The satirist poet Martianus, who lived on the 3rd floor of the insula, complained that even Boreas, the god of north wind, would not agree to dwell in his room, as it was impossible to close the window tightly. Marcian, on the other hand, mentions such upper apartments under the roof tiles, where one could not straighten up to his full height. A typical apartment in an insula usually had 2 rooms of 10 to 20 square meters. The area of expensive apartments on the 1st floor could be up to 200 square meters. The only means of heating in insulas were often fireplaces, which produced a lot of smoke and soot and posed a serious fire hazard. Firewood was not cheap. Although heating existed already in ancient Rome, it was only in mansions or baths. Rooms were heated by pipes through which hot air flowed. Lighting was provided by oil lamps, which, however, produced more soot than light. The poor and the lumpen often had to seek shelter in basements or under staircases in the insulae, as well as under bridges. Civil servants were allowed to spend the night in public buildings. Antique sources report a large number of thefts in the insulae. The owners of the insulae often did not care to repair them until collapses occurred. Seneca mentions insulae familiar to the Roman eye in cracks and holes. Rents in Roman tenement houses were quite high and in the early empire ranged from a few hundred to several thousand sesterces a year, with the earnings of a common laborer on the order of a few sesterces a day. Cicero, who owned a number of insulae, mentioned serious difficulties in collecting fees from tenants. According to Suetonius, even senators sometimes had to skip meetings to find cheaper housing. In some cases the government exempted the plebs from paying rent. So Caesar's edict exempted from payment those for whom housing in Rome cost up to 2,000 sestertii a year, and in the vicinity, up to 500.